It all started as a romantic getaway. My husband, David, and I booked a cozy cabin in the heart of the Bitterroot Mountains, a remote corner of Idaho. It was late February, and we were craving a break from the city, a weekend of snowshoeing, fireside snuggles, and hopefully, a bit of the northern lights if we were lucky. We'd been together for 5 years, married for 2, and life had become a comfortable routine. This trip was meant to be a spark, a reminder of the adventures we used to have. We drove for hours, leaving the highway behind for winding, snow-covered roads. The lodge we'd booked, the Whispering Pines Retreat, was nestled deep in a valley, accessible only by a single, narrow track. When we finally arrived, late Friday afternoon, the sky was a bruised purple, heavy with the promise of snow. The lodge was quaint, to say the least. Rustic, with a hint of neglect, but it had a certain charm. The first night was perfect. We ate a dinner of chili by the fire, laughing and talking, feeling the stress of our daily lives melt away. It started snowing as we were drifting off to sleep, a gentle dusting at first, then heavier, the wind whispering around the cabin. By morning, it was a full-blown blizzard. The world outside was a swirling white chaos. The lodge owner, a gruff, older man named Mr. Henson, told us the road was impassable. "You're stuck here till it clears," he said, his tone not exactly apologetic. "Could be a day, could be 3. David, ever the optimist, took it in stride. "More time to relax," he said, kissing my forehead. But I felt a prickle of unease. We were truly isolated, with no phone signal and only a crackling radio for communication. By the afternoon, the wind was howling, rattling the windows, and the snow was piling up in drifts. Cabin fever set in quickly. Bored and restless, we decided to explore the surrounding area a little, bundled up in our warmest gear. About half a mile from the lodge, we stumbled upon an old, abandoned ranger station. It was a small, wooden structure, almost buried in the snow. Curiosity and a desire to escape the confining walls of the lodge led us to push open the creaking door. Inside, it was dim and cold. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light that penetrated the grimy windows. Old maps were pinned to the walls, and a rusty wood stove stood in the corner. But it was the photographs that caught our attention. They were scattered across a table, black and white portraits, each depicting a person standing in the snow, staring directly at the camera with an unsettling intensity. One photo, in particular, gave me chills. It showed the very ranger station we were standing in, and at one of the windows, a dark, indistinct figure was visible. "Creepy," I murmured, handing it to David. He examined it closely. "What's weird is look at the snow outside the station in the picture. It's untouched, like whoever took this, did it without leaving any footprints." I shrugged it off, trying to sound nonchalant. Probably just an old trick of the light. Double exposure or something. But a sliver of doubt had taken root. It felt strange, like the photo was watching us as much as we were looking at it. We continued to look around. It was like stepping back in time. We found an old journal on a dusty shelf. It belonged to a photographer named Arthur Sterling, who had apparently disappeared from this area decades ago. We flipped through the yellowed pages, his neat handwriting filling each one with details of his work, the local wildlife, the changing weather. Then we reached the last entry. It was dated February 22nd, 1978, and it sent a shiver down my spine. "They don't like being photographed. They will have the last photo with me soon." "What the hell does that mean?" David asked, his brow furrowed. He quickly flipped back, searching for any other clue to the context. There was nothing to add any clarity. The page immediately previous spoke only of the local weather that day. We looked at each other with a shared sense of unease. The storm outside seemed to intensify, mirroring the growing tension inside us. Back at the lodge, we tried to dismiss the journal entry as the ramblings of a lonely, perhaps unstable man. But as the wind howled and the snow piled up, trapping us, the words echoed in my mind. That night, things took a turn. It started with a sound, a soft, rhythmic thudding, like footsteps circling the ranger station. We were back in the cabin, reading by the fire, the storm raging outside. At first, I dismissed it as the wind, but it persisted, growing steadily louder. David heard it too. He put down his book, his face etched with concern. "What is that?" "I don't know," I whispered, my heart starting to beat faster. "Probably just the wind." I went to the window and pulled back a curtain. The swirling snow made it hard to see anything, but I strained my eyes, trying to pierce the white void. Then, I saw it. A dark figure, silhouetted against the snow, standing just beyond the perimeter of the light cast by the cabin's windows. It was too far away to make out any details, but it was definitely there, and it was definitely looking at us. "David," I breathed, my voice trembling. "There's someone out there." He rushed to the window, peering out. He saw it too. The figure remained motionless, a silent observer in the raging storm. Fear, cold and sharp, began to grip me. This was no longer a trick of the light, no figment of an overactive imagination. Someone, or something, was out there, and it was watching us. We spent the rest of the night in a state of heightened anxiety. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, sent a jolt of fear through us. We took turns keeping watch, peering out into the blizzard, but the figure was gone. The next morning, the storm showed no signs of abating. We were trapped, isolated, and the events of the previous night had shattered our sense of security. We went back to the ranger station. The pictures on the table seemed different now, colder, the subjects more menacing. We went back to the journal and studied it closely again. We found no other relevant details. That night, it happened again. The footsteps, the figure in the snow. But this time, it was closer, much closer, and it was holding something. We saw the flicker of a small light in one hand. As we watched, frozen in terror, a flash of lightning illuminated the scene. For a split second, we saw the figure clearly. It was tall and gaunt, its face obscured by the shadows, and in its hand, it held an old-fashioned camera. The camera, just like in Arthur Sterling's journal. Panic seized us. The figure started to move, slowly, deliberately, towards the cabin. Each flash of lightning revealed it closer, its movements jerky and unnatural. Then, it was inside. Not through the door, not through the window, but simply inside. We were in the main room, huddled by the dying embers of the fire. The figure appeared in the corner, emerging from the shadows. It stood there, silent and still, the camera held up to its face. We scrambled back, screaming, our voices swallowed by the roar of the storm. The figure advanced, its movements slow and deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. David grabbed a poker from the fireplace, holding it out defensively. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice cracking with fear. The figure didn't respond. It simply raised the camera and took a picture. The flash was blinding, momentarily illuminating the room and casting grotesque shadows on the walls. Then it was gone. We were left in the darkness, our hearts pounding, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. We didn't know what it was, what it wanted, but one thing was clear. We were not safe. The rest of the night was a blur of terror. We huddled together, listening to the storm, waiting for the figure to return. We knew, somehow, that it would. It was toying with us, playing a sick game. At some point, we must have fallen into a fitful sleep, because I was startled awake by David shaking me. "Look," he whispered, pointing to the window. The storm had finally passed. The sun was rising, casting a pale, ethereal light over the snow-covered landscape. And standing outside, in the exact spot where the figure had been, were footprints. A single set of footprints, leading away from the cabin and disappearing into the trees. We were alive. We had survived the night, but the ordeal had left us scarred, changed. We packed our things in a frantic haste, desperate to escape the cursed valley and the memory of the figure with the camera. The snow was coming down hard, a swirling vortex of white that blurred the lines between road and sky. I was driving my younger brother, Noah, to a winter retreat in the remote reaches of northern Wyoming. We were on a desolate stretch of highway, somewhere between the tiny towns of Harmony Springs and Elk Ridge, the landscape a monotonous expanse of snow-covered fields and skeletal trees. The radio was spitting out static, the only other sound the rhythmic swish of the wipers battling the accumulating snow. I glanced at Noah in the passenger seat. He was engrossed in a comic book, oblivious to the worsening conditions. He was 15, 4 years younger than me, and this trip was my responsibility. Our parents were overseas, and I was determined to get him to this retreat, a chance for him to make friends and enjoy some winter fun. Suddenly, the car sputtered, coughed, and died. I coasted to a stop on the shoulder, the silence amplified by the howling wind. "What happened?" Noah asked, looking up from his comic, his brow furrowed with concern. "I don't know," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "It just stopped. I tried to restart the engine, but it was no use. It wouldn't even turn over. We were stranded." A wave of anxiety washed over me. We were miles from anywhere, the storm was getting worse, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. I pulled out my phone, but there was no signal. Of course, just when panic started to set in, I saw a faint glow in the distance. A gas station, a beacon of hope in the desolate landscape. We bundled up, grabbed our essentials, and started trudging through the snow, the wind whipping at our faces. The gas station was old and run down, the kind of place that time seemed to have forgotten. A single, flickering fluorescent light illuminated the interior, casting long, eerie shadows. The attendant, a grizzled old man with a weathered face, looked up from his newspaper as we entered. "Car trouble?" he asked, his voice raspy. "Yeah," I said. "It just died on us. Can you take a look?" He shook his head. "Won't be able to do much in this weather. And my mechanic's gone for the day. You'll have to wait for a tow truck. Could be a while, though. Roads are pretty bad." He then added with a grim look, "You two should know. There's a dangerous fellow on the loose. Escaped from the Blackwood Institute just a few hours ago. They say he's armed and extremely volatile. Best stay inside." My heart sank. This was just great. Stranded in a blizzard with a potentially dangerous fugitive on the loose. I forced a smile, trying to project an air of confidence for Noah's sake. "We'll be fine," I said. "We'll just wait it out." The attendant grunted, returning to his newspaper. We huddled by the door, feeling the cold seep in through the cracks. The tow truck, as the attendant predicted, was going to be a long wait. With no other options, we decided to head to a nearby diner, a small, brightly lit building across the street. It was the only other sign of life in this frozen wasteland. The diner was a relic from a bygone era, with red vinyl booths, a Formica countertop, and a jukebox in the corner. It was surprisingly busy, filled with other stranded travelers seeking refuge from the storm. We found an empty booth and settled in, trying to get warm. There were a few other people in the diner. A burly truck driver, a middle-aged woman who introduced herself as a nurse, and a quiet, unassuming man sitting alone in a corner booth, nursing a cup of coffee. We ordered some hot chocolate, trying to make the best of the situation. Noah, surprisingly, seemed to be taking it all in stride. He was chatting with the truck driver, a jovial man named Mr. Peterson, about his comic book collection. As the evening wore on, the atmosphere in the diner grew tense. The news on the small TV behind the counter kept repeating the story of the escaped inmate, a man named Arthur Monroe, describing him as highly dangerous and unpredictable. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were trapped in a real-life horror movie. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind that rattled the windows, sent a jolt of unease through me. I started to scrutinize the other people in the diner, wondering if one of them could be the fugitive. The nurse, Mrs. Evans, seemed genuinely kind, offering blankets and sharing stories of her work. Mr. Peterson, the trucker, was loud but harmless, his booming laughter filling the diner. But the quiet man, Mr. Smith, he was the one who made me uneasy. He barely spoke, kept to himself, and there was something about his eyes, a coldness, a detachment, that sent shivers down my spine. Then, Noah disappeared. He had gone to the restroom, and after 15 minutes, he still hadn't returned. I started to worry, a knot of fear tightening in my stomach. I went to check on him, calling his name, but there was no answer. The restroom was empty. Panic seized me. I rushed back to our booth, my heart pounding in my chest. "Noah's gone," I exclaimed, my voice trembling. Mrs. Evans and Mr. Peterson looked at me with concern. Mr. Smith, however, remained impassive, his eyes fixed on his coffee cup. Maybe he went outside? Mrs. Evans suggested, trying to sound reassuring. I ran to the front door, but it was locked. I peered out the window, but the swirling snow made it impossible to see anything. Then, I saw it. A trail of red droplets on the floor, leading from the restroom to the back exit. Blood. My blood ran cold. It was Noah's blood. He hadn't just wandered off. Someone had taken him. The back door was unlocked, slightly ajar. I pushed it open, stepping out into the blinding snow. The wind howled, tearing at my clothes, the cold biting into my skin. "Noah!" I screamed, my voice swallowed by the storm. There was no answer, only the deafening roar of the wind and the swirling snow. I stumbled back inside, my mind reeling. The quiet man, Mr. Smith, was now standing, his eyes fixed on me. There was a strange glint in his eyes, a predatory gleam that sent a chill down my spine. "Looking for someone?" he asked, his voice low and menacing. The other two also sensed the change in the air. Mrs. Evans was frozen, staring at Smith, her eyes wide in a silent scream. Mr. Peterson had backed himself up against the wall, his usual cheery facade replaced with shock. He lunged at me, his movements surprisingly quick for a man his size. I dodged his grasp, my heart pounding in my chest. "You're him," I gasped, my voice trembling. "You're Arthur Monroe?" He smiled, a chilling, predatory grin. "Took you long enough to figure it out," he said. The diner erupted in chaos. Mrs. Evans screamed. Mr. Peterson tried to intervene, but Monroe was too strong. He overpowered him easily, knocking him to the ground. I knew I had to get out of there, to find Noah, to get help, but Monroe was blocking the front door, and the back door led to the blinding blizzard. I was trapped. The ensuing minutes were a blur of terror. Monroe was a monster, fueled by some unknown rage, and I was his prey. He chased me through the diner, overturning tables, smashing chairs, his laughter echoing in the confined space. Somehow, amidst the chaos, I managed to grab a heavy glass ashtray from one of the tables. As he lunged at me again, I swung it with all my might, connecting with the side of his head. He stumbled, momentarily stunned, and I used the opportunity to escape through the back door, into the raging storm. I had to find Noah. I stumbled through the snow, calling his name, my voice hoarse, my body numb with cold. I followed the faint trail of blood, praying that it would lead me to him. And then, I saw him. He was huddled behind a dumpster, hidden from view, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. He had a deep cut on his right arm, but he was alive. "Noah!" I cried, rushing to his side. He looked up at me, relief flooding his eyes. "Lily," he whispered, his voice weak. He tried to take me, but I got away. I hid. I held him close, tears streaming down my face. He was safe. He was alive. Using the light from the diner, we made it back to the gas station. I burst in, screaming for help. The old attendant, startled by my sudden appearance, quickly called the police. When the police finally arrived, they found Monroe in the diner, subdued and bleeding from the head wound. But that wasn't all. As they were taking statements from everyone, they discovered that Mr. Peterson, the seemingly harmless truck driver, was involved in some illicit activity. He was using his truck to transport illegal goods, and the diner was one of his drop-off points. He had planned to make an exchange that night, but the blizzard and the unexpected arrival of Monroe had thrown a wrench in his plans. It was a shocking revelation, a twist I never saw coming. The real danger, it turned out, wasn't just the escaped fugitive, but also the seemingly ordinary man hiding a dark secret. The aftermath was a blur of police reports, medical attention, and the long, slow process of recovery. Noah's arm was treated, and he eventually recovered from the physical wounds. But the emotional scars, the trauma of that night, would take much longer to heal. It was supposed to be a scenic journey, a nostalgic trip across the country on the Northern Star, a vintage train that promised breathtaking views and a taste of old-world luxury. I boarded in late December, the train cars decked out in festive garlands, and the air filled with the scent of pine and cinnamon. I was traveling alone, seeking solace and a change of scenery after a difficult year. The train was full of diverse characters: families on holiday, elderly couples reminiscing about their youth, and a few solo travelers like myself. We were a microcosm of society, hurtling through the snowy landscapes of the northern states. Our route took us through the majestic peaks of the Cascade Mountains, a remote and sparsely populated region. The scenery was indeed stunning. Towering evergreens blanketed in white, frozen rivers glinting in the pale sunlight, and snow-capped mountains that seemed to touch the sky. The first few days were uneventful, filled with pleasant conversations, gourmet meals in the dining car, and the rhythmic clatter of the train on the tracks. Among the passengers, one woman, in particular, caught my attention. She was an enigma, always dressed in a long, pristine white coat, her face pale and framed by dark hair. She sat alone in the observation car, staring out at the passing landscape, a silent and solitary figure. She never spoke to anyone, never joined the communal activities, and there was an air of melancholy about her that intrigued me. I tried to engage her in conversation a few times, but she simply turned away, her silence more eloquent than any words. The sense of unease began subtly. It was the third evening when the first incident occurred. We were traversing a particularly isolated stretch of the Cascades when a sudden jolt shook the train. We came to a grinding halt, the abrupt stop throwing passengers from their seats. Murmurs of confusion and concern rippled through the cars. Then came the announcement from the conductor, a man named Mr. Harrison, his usually jovial voice laced with anxiety. "Ladies and gentlemen, we seem to have encountered a slight problem. An avalanche has blocked the tracks ahead. We're going to be here for a while." A collective groan rose from the passengers. A while in this remote wilderness could mean hours, even days. We were stranded, miles from any town or settlement, with the temperature outside plummeting rapidly. As the initial shock subsided, a strange chill began to permeate the train. It wasn't just the cold seeping in from outside. It was a deeper, more pervasive cold that seemed to emanate from within. Frost started to appear on the inside of the windows, intricate patterns that resembled frozen tears. Then came the whispers. At first, I dismissed them as the wind whistling through the gaps in the train's old structure, but they persisted, growing louder, more distinct. It sounded like voices, hushed and murmuring, just at the edge of hearing. I wasn't the only one who noticed. Other passengers reported hearing them too, whispers in the empty corridors, in the quiet corners of the observation car. The unease escalated when Mr. Peterson, a boisterous businessman who had been regaling everyone with tales of his exploits, disappeared. One moment he was in the dining car, holding court. The next, he was gone. His coat, a heavy tweed overcoat, was found abandoned on his seat. A search of the train yielded nothing. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Panic began to set in. The whispers, the frost, the disappearance, it all felt connected, somehow. And then there was the woman in white. She remained as aloof and silent as ever, but now a new element had been added to her repertoire, a low, haunting hum. It was a melody I vaguely recognized, an old lullaby, melancholic and unsettling. It was Mr. Harrison, the conductor, who inadvertently provided a possible explanation. He was an older man, a veteran of these tracks, and he had heard the local legends. He gathered us in the dining car, his face grim. "There's an old story," he began, his voice low and hesitant, "about a woman named Clara. They say she was waiting for her fiancé, a railway worker, at a small station along this very stretch of tracks. This was over a century ago. He never arrived. A telegram came later reporting that he died in a work accident. She refused to believe it and kept waiting. She froze to death there, waiting in vain. Some say, every 10 years, during a major blizzard, she returns, searching for him." He paused, letting the story sink in. "They say she takes warmth from the living, to fight off the cold that still consumes her." The story, though fantastical, resonated with the strange events we were experiencing. The cold, the whispers, the disappearance, it all seemed to fit. And the woman in white, with her haunting lullaby and her constant presence in the observation car, which overlooked the stretch of tracks where the legend supposedly took place. Could she be Clara? The blizzard outside intensified, mirroring the growing fear within the train. We were trapped in a metal tube, in the middle of nowhere, with a potential phantom. A group of us, united by our shared fear and a desperate need to understand, decided to investigate. We started with the woman in white. We approached her cautiously, our hearts pounding. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. She looked up, her eyes, for the first time, meeting mine. They were a startling shade of blue, filled with a deep sadness. She didn't answer. "Are you Clara?" Another passenger, a young woman named Sarah, asked. The woman in white simply continued to hum, the lullaby growing louder, more insistent. We decided to search the train for clues, for anything that could shed light on the legend or the woman's identity. We found an old, leather-bound journal in the baggage car, hidden amongst a pile of dusty trunks. It belonged to a railway worker from the late 1800s, and it contained a detailed account of the very legend Mr. Harrison had mentioned. The journal confirmed the story of Clara, her fiancé's death, and her tragic demise. But it also contained something else, a mention of a specific song, a lullaby that Clara used to sing to her fiancé. The melody was described in detail, and it matched the one the woman in white was humming. The pieces started to fall into place. The woman in white wasn't a ghost, but she was undeniably connected to the legend. Perhaps she was a descendant of Clara, drawn to this place by some familial connection. Perhaps the trauma of the story had somehow manifested in her, causing her to reenact Clara's vigil. The disappearance of Mr. Peterson, however, remained a mystery. We searched the train again, more thoroughly this time, and then we found it. A small, almost hidden compartment behind a panel in the dining car. Inside, huddled and shivering, was Mr. Peterson. He was disoriented, confused, and suffering from hypothermia. He claimed he had been lured into the compartment by a whisper, a voice that promised him warmth. He remembered nothing else. The truth, when it finally dawned on us, was both shocking and heartbreakingly mundane. The woman in white, whose real name we learned was Eleanor, was not a malevolent spirit. She was a deeply troubled woman, suffering from a rare form of dissociative disorder triggered by the story of her ancestor, Clara, and perhaps exacerbated by the isolation and the stress of the situation. The whispers were likely a combination of the wind, the train's noises, and the power of suggestion. Mr. Peterson, in his inebriated state and desperate search for warmth, had likely stumbled upon the hidden compartment himself, his memory playing tricks on him, influenced by the legend and the general atmosphere of fear. The realization brought a strange sense of relief, mixed with a profound sadness for Eleanor. She was not a monster, but a victim herself, trapped in a cycle of delusion and grief. We managed to contact emergency services via a satellite phone found in the conductor's cabin. It took several hours, but a rescue team eventually reached us, clearing the tracks and guiding the train to the nearest town. Eleanor was taken to a hospital, where she could receive the help she needed. The rest of us, shaken but safe, continued our journeys, forever changed by the experience. The call came in just after midnight. A group of hikers, caught in an unexpected blizzard, was missing somewhere in the San Juan Mountains. I was part of the volunteer search and rescue team, the new guy, eager to prove myself. My name is Alex, and this was my first real mission. I trained for months, practiced scenarios, but nothing could truly prepare you for the reality of a mountain rescue in a raging storm. We assembled at the trailhead, a team of 5, led by the seasoned veteran, Captain Hayes. The others were Mark, a stoic ex-military type, Sarah, a paramedic with nerves of steel, and Ben, a local guide who knew these mountains like the back of his hand. The air was thick with snow, the wind howling like a banshee, and the temperature well below freezing. It was the kind of weather that could kill you if you weren't careful. Our mission was to locate a group of 4 hikers who had set out earlier that day for a multi-day trek through a remote section of the San Juans. They were experienced, well-equipped, but the sudden blizzard had caught everyone off guard. Their last known location was somewhere near the treacherous Devil's Pass, a narrow, winding trail that snaked its way through a steep, avalanche-prone valley. We set off into the blinding white, our headlamps cutting narrow tunnels through the swirling snow. The wind tore at our clothes, the cold seeping into our bones despite our layers of gear. We moved slowly, methodically, calling out the hikers' names, our voices swallowed by the storm. The first sign of the hikers came a few hours later. A discarded backpack, half buried in the snow. It was a high-end model, the kind favored by serious outdoor enthusiasts. A quick search revealed a half-eaten energy bar and a crumpled trail map. They were close, we could feel it. Hope surged through me, a much-needed jolt of adrenaline. We pressed on, following a faint trail of footprints that appeared and disappeared in the drifting snow. Then, we found another sign. A single, brightly colored glove, lying abandoned on the trail. "They're shedding gear," Ben commented, his brow furrowed. "That's not good. Could be a sign of hypothermia, starting to lose their sense of reason." A knot of unease tightened in my stomach. Hypothermia was a silent killer, insidious and unpredictable. It could make people do irrational things, like discard essential clothing in a desperate, misguided attempt to cool down. We continued our search, the tension growing with each passing hour. The storm showed no signs of abating. If anything, it was getting worse. Visibility was down to a few feet, and the wind was so strong it was hard to stand upright. Then, we found him, a figure, buried up to his chest in a snowdrift, barely visible in the swirling white. We rushed to his side, digging him out, our hearts pounding. It was one of the missing hikers, a young man, barely conscious, his lips blue, his body shivering uncontrollably. "We need to get him warm, fast," Sarah barked, already pulling out her medical kit. We worked quickly, wrapping him in emergency blankets, trying to stabilize his condition. He was incoherent, mumbling deliriously, his eyes wide with terror. Others, watching, he whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind. They took them." "Who took them?" Captain Hayes asked, his voice urgent. "Where are the others?" But the hiker slipped back into unconsciousness, his words lost to the storm. A sense of dread began to creep over me. What had he meant by others watching? And who had taken the rest of his group? This was starting to feel like more than just a simple rescue mission. We tried to radio for a helicopter evacuation, but the storm was interfering with the signal. All we got was static. We were on our own, following the hiker's tracks, which were miraculously still visible in some areas. We pressed on, hoping to find the rest of his group. The trail led us to a remote cabin, nestled in a small clearing, barely visible through the trees. It was the kind of place that wasn't marked on any map, a hidden refuge known only to locals. "Maybe they took shelter here," Mark suggested, his hand resting on the rifle slung across his back. We approached cautiously, our senses on high alert. The cabin looked deserted, but there were signs of recent activity. Fresh footprints in the snow, a wisp of smoke curling from the chimney. Captain Hayes signaled us to spread out, covering all angles. He pushed open the door, his rifle raised. We followed him inside, our headlamps sweeping across the interior. The scene that greeted us was horrific. The cabin was a scene straight out of a nightmare. Blood splattered the walls, furniture was overturned, and there were clear signs of a violent struggle. In the corner, a makeshift cage made of wooden slats stood ominously. It was empty, but a thick, dark stain on the floor inside suggested its recent occupant hadn't fared well. A wave of nausea washed over me. This wasn't a rescue mission anymore. It was a crime scene. "What the hell happened here?" Ben whispered, his face pale with shock. I noticed something on the wall, a collection of photographs pinned haphazardly to the rough-hewn wooden planks. I moved closer, my heart pounding in my chest. The photographs were a gallery of horrors. Each one depicted a different group of people, some in hiking gear, some in climbing gear, all with the same terrified look in their eyes. Some of the photos showed people tied up, others showed them injured, and some showed them dead. And then I saw it. A photograph of a search and rescue team, their faces grim, their eyes hollow. They were wearing the same uniforms we were. The photo was dated exactly 1 year ago. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The missing hikers weren't lost. They were bait, and we, the rescuers, were now the prey. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice trembling. "Now." Captain Hayes, his face grim, nodded in agreement. "We've been set up. This is a trap." We turned to leave, but it was too late. A figure emerged from the shadows, blocking the doorway. He was tall and burly, dressed in tattered camouflage gear, his face obscured by a mask made from animal hide. He held a hunting rifle in his hands, and his eyes, visible through the eye holes of the mask, gleamed with a predatory intensity. "Leaving so soon?" he said, his voice muffled by the mask, a chillingly calm tone that sent shivers down my spine. "The fun's just about to begin." Behind him, two more figures appeared, equally menacing, armed with crude but deadly weapons. We were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped. The hunters, for that's what they were, advanced slowly, deliberately, savoring our fear. They were clearly experienced in this. They enjoyed the hunt, the terror they inflicted. What followed was a desperate fight for survival. We used whatever we could find as weapons, a fire poker, a heavy wooden chair, even our rescue gear. But they were stronger, more skilled, and they knew the terrain. One by one, my team members fell. Ben was the first, taken down by a blow to the head. Sarah fought bravely, but she was no match for their brute strength. Mark managed to wound one of them with his rifle, but he was quickly overwhelmed. Captain Hayes, in a final act of defiance, charged at the leader, tackling him to the ground. But the other two hunters were on him in an instant, and the fight was over. I was the last one standing, cornered, terrified, but strangely calm. I knew this was it. There was no escape. The leader approached me, his rifle pointed at my chest. He removed his mask, revealing a face that was both ordinary and terrifying. He looked like any other man you might pass on the street, but his eyes, they were the eyes of a predator, cold, calculating, and devoid of any empathy. "Any last words?" he asked, a cruel smile playing on his lips. I stared back at him, my mind racing. I had to do something, anything. I couldn't just give up. I thought of the hikers, of my team, of all the victims in those photographs. Then, I remembered the hiker we had found, the one who was still alive. He was our only hope. "The hiker," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "He's still alive. You didn't finish the job?" The hunter's smile faltered. A flicker of doubt crossed his face. "He's alive," I repeated, pressing my advantage. "And he can identify you. He can tell them everything." The hunter hesitated, his eyes darting around the room. He knew I was right. A living witness was a liability, a loose end. He turned to his companions, a silent conversation passing between them. They seemed to weigh their options, the thrill of the hunt battling with the instinct for self-preservation. Finally, he lowered his rifle. "We'll take care of him," he said, his voice flat, "and then we'll come back for you." They left, disappearing into the storm, leaving me alone in the blood-soaked cabin, surrounded by the ghosts of their victims. I don't know how long I stayed there, huddled in the corner, waiting for them to return, but they never did. Eventually, I found the strength to move. I stumbled out of the cabin and into the blinding snow, following their tracks back to where we had found the injured hiker. He was still there, barely alive, but clinging to life. I managed to get him to the radio and, miraculously, the signal went through. A rescue helicopter arrived a few hours later, plucking us from the mountain and carrying us to safety. The hiker survived. He was able to give a description of the hunters, and they were eventually apprehended. They were a group of survivalists, living off the grid, who had been using the remote wilderness as their own private hunting ground for years. The story made national headlines. The San Juan Hunters, as they were dubbed by the media, became infamous. But for me, the ordeal was far from over. I was hailed as a hero, but I didn't feel like one. I was haunted by the memory of my fallen team members, by the faces in those photographs, by the chilling realization that such evil could exist in the world. I left the search and rescue team. I couldn't face the mountains anymore, not after what I had seen, what I had experienced. The wilderness, once a place of beauty and adventure, had become a symbol of terror.